The Nile's Daughter, Cleopatra's Origins. In the golden light of ancient Alexandria, where marble columns lined the streets and the sea breeze carried the scent of myrrh and salt, Cleopatra VII was born, not merely a princess of Egypt, but a descendant of gods and conquerors. She entered a world already heavy with history, born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family of Macedonian Greek origin that had ruled Egypt since the days of Alexander the Great. Her bloodline was steeped in power, glory, and paradox. Foreigners ruling an ancient land, speaking Greek in the court of pharaohs, worshipping Greek deities alongside Egyptian gods, and balancing fragile alliances while internal betrayal rotted their foundations. Cleopatra's Egypt was not the Egypt of the Old Kingdom with its divine pharaohs who built the pyramids, nor the new kingdom of Thutmose and Ramses. It was a cosmopolitan and culturally blended realm, centered in Alexandria, a city that stood as a beacon of Hellenistic power and intellectual brilliance. Here stood the Great Library of Alexandria, drawing scholars from all over the known world. And here, behind the walls of the royal palace, the Ptolemaic court plotted, poisoned, and postured with ruthless ambition. Cleopatra's early life is a tapestry only partially preserved by history's pen. She was born in 69 BCE to Ptolemy XII Auletes, the flute player king, known more for his extravagance and dependence on Roman support than for his leadership. Her mother is believed to have been Cleopatra V Tryphena, though historical certainty escapes us. What is clear is that from the start, Cleopatra was immersed in a world where legitimacy could be fleeting and survival depended on wit as much as birthright. Her family ruled with an iron grip disguised in gold, lavish temples to appease the people, spectacles to dazzle the masses, but behind closed doors the Ptolemies had long since abandoned the illusion of unity. Sibling rivalry was the norm, and murder within the family was almost expected. In this environment, Cleopatra learned early that affection could be weaponized, and alliances were the currency of power. She was not the eldest daughter, nor the most favored at first, but she possessed what many of her kin lacked: intellect, charisma, and a will forged in fire. What set Cleopatra apart, even in her formative years, was her devotion to Egypt itself. While her siblings remained cloaked in Greek customs, Cleopatra dared to speak the Egyptian language, a rare gesture from a Ptolemaic ruler. She adopted the iconography of Isis, the mother goddess, and cast herself in divine light. Not just a queen, but a protector of the people, a living deity in human form. Her understanding of politics was not confined to Greek tradition, but was enriched by the dual identity of her realm: Hellenistic in structure, Egyptian in soul. Her education was extensive. The Ptolemies valued Greek learning, and Cleopatra was tutored in philosophy, oratory, mathematics, and astronomy. She read Homer and studied Plato. She learned to navigate political nuance, mastering rhetoric and debate. It is said she spoke as many as 9 languages, a necessity in a world divided by dialects and diplomacy. This linguistic skill would later charm emperors, bend senators, and allow her to speak directly to her subjects without interpreters. Cleopatra was not merely a queen in training. She was a diplomat, a scholar, and a strategist before she wore the crown. Yet all the preparation in the world could not shield her from the brutal realities of Ptolemaic rule. Her father, Ptolemy XII, was exiled after a popular uprising, forced to seek refuge in Rome. Cleopatra, even as a girl, watched her family's fate hang on the whims of foreign powers. Rome was rising, and Egypt, though still wealthy, had become more of a prize than a peer. Her father's restoration to the throne was secured not by Egyptian loyalty but Roman swords. This dependence left a bitter imprint on the young Cleopatra, who understood that Rome could make or break her family's dynasty. Upon Ptolemy XII's death, the will he left behind would ignite a maelstrom. Cleopatra, around 18 years old, was named co-ruler with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. It was tradition in the dynasty to marry within the family, and Cleopatra was expected to wed her sibling, though their union was a political formality more than a romantic bond. The arrangement quickly soured. Ptolemy XIII, manipulated by powerful advisors like the eunuch Pothinus, sought to rule alone. Cleopatra was pushed aside, exiled from Alexandria, and forced to flee with a small group of loyalists to the desert. It was here, in exile, that Cleopatra's mettle was tested. Stripped of her throne, without a Roman alliance to lean on, she did not collapse. She schemed, negotiated, and prepared for her return. She raised an army, but more importantly, she watched Rome's politics closely. Julius Caesar, one of Rome's most formidable generals, had just arrived in Alexandria, pursuing his rival Pompey. The timing was divine. Cleopatra knew that if she could align herself with Caesar, she could restore her rule, not just as a figurehead, but as Egypt's sole monarch. But the Cleopatra that would soon appear before Caesar was not a desperate exile. She would enter the palace in secret, famously smuggled in rolled inside a carpet or sack, depending on the account, a gesture both theatrical and strategic. In that moment, Cleopatra ceased to be merely the daughter of the Nile. She became its voice, its seductress, its shield. Caesar, seasoned in war and weary of deception, found in Cleopatra a mind as sharp as his own and a spirit not easily cowed. Their meeting would shift the fate of empires, though history would later portray her as a seductress who ensnared Roman men with beauty and charm. The truth is more nuanced. Cleopatra's power was not in her appearance alone, but in her intellect, her political acumen, and her ability to embody the aspirations of a dying dynasty with the poise of a sovereign reborn. She was Egypt in flesh and spirit, and her return to Alexandria marked not just the restoration of a queen, but the rise of a legend. Rome's Titan, the rise of Julius Caesar. In the streets of ancient Rome, where ambition stirred with every footfall and the cries of vendors blended with the echo of marching legions, a man was born who would reshape not just a republic, but the world. Gaius Julius Caesar entered history on July 12th or 13th, 100 BCE, born into the Julian gens, a patrician family that claimed divine descent from Venus through Aeneas. Yet despite this noble ancestry, the Julii were far from the pinnacles of political power at the time of Caesar's birth. His path to greatness was neither guaranteed nor smooth. It was carved through turmoil, bloodshed, and an unquenchable thirst for glory. Caesar's early years were marked by both privilege and peril. His father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, served as a governor in Asia, but died suddenly when the young Caesar was just 16. This thrust the boy into adulthood and into the care of his mother, Aurelia, a woman of intelligence and iron resolve. She would guide him through the treacherous political environment of Rome, where alliances shifted like sand and betrayal was an everyday currency. Caesar's coming of age occurred during the dictatorship of Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man whose ruthlessness left deep scars on the Roman psyche. When Sulla seized control and began purging his enemies, Caesar found himself in the crosshairs, not for what he had done, but for what he represented. He had married Cornelia, the daughter of a man who had opposed Sulla. The dictator ordered Caesar to divorce her. Caesar refused. For this defiance, he was stripped of his inheritance, his priesthood, and forced into hiding. He wandered the countryside, hunted, sick and penniless, but unbroken. Friends and allies interceded on his behalf, and Sulla ultimately relented, supposedly remarking that in Caesar lay many a Marius, referencing the populist general who had once threatened Rome's elite. The statement was prophetic. Caesar would indeed rise, and the old order would never be the same. Once Sulla died, Caesar returned to Rome and began his slow, methodical climb. He joined the army, serving with distinction in Asia and Cilicia, earning the Corona Civica, Rome's highest military decoration, for saving the life of a fellow soldier in battle. His early military service revealed a crucial element of Caesar's character. He was not merely a patrician with lofty ideals, but a man of action who inspired loyalty through courage and charisma. His soldiers would come to adore him, not only for his battlefield brilliance, but for the way he shared in their hardships, walked among them, and addressed them as equals in purpose. Yet Caesar's real genius lay in his ability to navigate the chaotic whirlpool of Roman politics. Upon returning to Rome, he began climbing the cursus honorum, the sequential order of political offices. He dazzled in courtrooms with his oratory, drawing comparisons to Cicero himself. He threw lavish games and public spectacles, earning the adoration of the plebeians while driving the Senate to uneasy glances. In 63 BCE, he was elected Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, an office he used not only for religious authority, but as a tool to project moral superiority and deepen his political base. As the Republic teetered under the weight of corruption, inequality, and infighting, Caesar understood that real power could only be achieved through coalition. He formed the first triumvirate in 60 BCE with Pompey the Great and Marcus Licinius Crassus, two of the most powerful men in Rome. Each man brought something to the table. Pompey had military prestige, Crassus had immense wealth, and Caesar had popularity and vision. Together, they manipulated Roman politics, bypassed senatorial opposition, and distributed power among themselves. During this time, Caesar was elected consul in 59 BCE, and then secured a proconsular command in Gaul. It was here, in the wild, fog-laden forests and windswept plains of modern-day France, that Caesar transformed from a politician into a legend. Over the next decade, he led the Roman legions in the Gallic Wars, subduing tribes, expanding Rome's borders, and writing his own accounts of the campaigns, Commentari de Bello Gallico, in spare yet evocative prose that served both as propaganda and historical record. These conquests were brutal. Caesar did not hesitate to destroy cities, enslave populations, or annihilate those who resisted. But to Rome, he brought glory and spoils, and to his men he brought victory after victory. His reputation soared. The Senate grew anxious. Pompey, once his ally, now eyed him with suspicion, especially after Crassus died in battle in Parthia. The fragile balance of the triumvirate crumbled. Caesar, victorious in Gaul, was ordered to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. It was a trap. In 49 BCE, he made a choice that would forever alter the course of Western history. He crossed the Rubicon River with his army, a direct violation of Roman law and a declaration of civil war. Alea jacta est, he is said to have proclaimed, the die is cast. The civil war that followed was swift and decisive. Caesar marched on Rome, forcing Pompey to flee. In a whirlwind of campaigns across Spain, Greece, and Egypt, Caesar eliminated his enemies, outmaneuvered Pompey, and crushed resistance. Pompey himself met a tragic end in Egypt, murdered upon arrival by those who hoped to win Caesar's favour. It was here, in Alexandria, that the paths of Caesar and Cleopatra intertwined, two powerful figures from different worlds, drawn together by ambition, necessity, and eventually desire. But before their romance took root, Caesar stabilized Egypt, restored Cleopatra to the throne, and indulged in the opulence of her court. Even then, Rome beckoned. Upon his return, Caesar was declared dictator, first for a year, then for 10, and finally for life. He instituted sweeping reforms, relieving debt, expanding the Senate, restructuring the calendar, giving us the Julian calendar, and launching public works. But he also centralized power, undermined republican traditions, and made enemies among the senatorial elite. To some, he was a tyrant in the making. To others, he was the savior of Rome. His rise had been meteoric. From fugitive to general, from consul to conqueror, Julius Caesar embodied the transformation of Rome from republic to empire. He was more than a man. He was a symbol of power unchained, of genius unchecked. And yet, in the shadow of his greatness, daggers were already being sharpened. An affair of empires. Cleopatra meets Caesar. The sun rose over Alexandria with a golden shimmer that danced on the waters of the Nile Delta. A city built to dazzle, it was a cultural and political beacon of the ancient world, where Greek sophistication met Egyptian majesty. And within the walls of its gleaming palaces, a drama unfolded that would not only entwine two of the ancient world's most formidable figures, but alter the trajectory of nations. When Cleopatra, the seventh Philopator, first met Julius Caesar, It was more than an encounter of rulers. It was the convergence of empires, destinies, and personal ambition. Cleopatra was no ordinary monarch. Born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Hellenistic line descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals, she was intelligent, multilingual, and politically astute. She understood the delicate balance of power between Rome and Egypt. Egypt was still rich and independent, but that independence teetered on the edge of Roman influence. Internally, the country was fractured. Cleopatra had been ousted from the throne by her younger brother and co-ruler Ptolemy XIII, thanks to the machinations of his advisors. Banished and marginalized, she did not accept defeat. She knew her worth and waited for the right moment to reclaim what was hers. That moment arrived in 48 BCE, when Caesar arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of his rival Pompey. Rome's civil war had spilled into Egypt's golden sands, and with it came an opportunity. Pompey had already been murdered by Ptolemy's court in a misguided attempt to curry favor with Caesar. But the assassination horrified Caesar instead of pleasing him. The political chessboard was already complex, and into this chaos Cleopatra maneuvered herself with legendary audacity. Knowing that the palace guards would never allow her entrance to Caesar while in exile, she famously had herself smuggled into the royal palace wrapped in a rug, or some accounts say a linen sack carried by her loyal servant. When the rug was unrolled before the Roman general, out stepped the young queen, radiant, poised, and unbending. Caesar was reportedly captivated. Whether by her beauty, intelligence, or sheer theatrical flair, she had made an unforgettable first impression. What followed was a rapid alliance. Personal, political, and strategic. Cleopatra needed Roman support to reclaim her throne. Caesar needed stability in Egypt, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. Together, they would achieve both aims, but their partnership quickly blossomed into something deeper. Cleopatra, then in her early 20s, was a woman unlike any Caesar had ever known. She matched his intellect, understood the game of empire, and wielded her femininity with precision, not as a weapon, but as a force of persuasion. Their liaison sparked a war within the palace walls. Ptolemy XIII and his regents refused to accept Caesar's interference. Tensions boiled over into open conflict. The siege of Alexandria ensued, pitting Caesar and Cleopatra's forces against Ptolemy's army. The city's famed Library of Alexandria may have partially burned during the fighting, an irreplaceable loss to human knowledge. The conflict culminated in the death of Ptolemy XIII, who drowned in the Nile while fleeing. With her brother gone, Cleopatra was reinstated as queen, though she was once again paired with a younger brother as co-ruler to satisfy traditional customs. In truth, Cleopatra ruled alone. She and Caesar now moved freely through Alexandria, the queen hosting lavish feasts and displaying the kind of grandeur that stunned even the Roman entourage. For Caesar, it was a respite from the political turbulence of Rome. For Cleopatra, it was a masterstroke of restoration. Their affair scandalized many in Rome. Caesar remained married to Calpurnia, and Roman sensibilities bristled at the thought of their general consorting with an exotic monarch. But Cleopatra was not simply a lover. She bore Caesar a son, Ptolemy XV, later known as Caesarion, or Little Caesar. His birth was more than symbolic. It was a claim to legitimacy, a union of two great dynasties. Cleopatra hoped their son would one day rule both Egypt and Rome, uniting East and West under a single lineage. In 46 BCE, Cleopatra travelled to Rome with Caesar, her presence stirring fascination and alarm in equal measure. She stayed at Caesar's villa outside the city, surrounded by luxury and foreign customs. Though not officially recognized as his consort, Cleopatra's influence was palpable. Statues were raised in her honor. Roman women reportedly admired her style and wit, while senators whispered about her proximity to the most powerful man in the Republic. But even as they walked among Rome's elite, their position was precarious. Caesar's accumulation of power, dictator for life, stoked fears that he aimed to become king, a title hated by Roman tradition. Cleopatra, viewed as a potential queen, became a living symbol of monarchical ambition. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE on the Ides of March, The knives pierced more than just his flesh. They severed the dreams of an empire reborn through east and west. Cleopatra, shocked and politically vulnerable, quickly left Rome with her son. Back in Egypt, she continued to rule. But the loss of Caesar left a vacuum that could not be filled. Her alliance with him had restored her crown and elevated her to near divine stature, but it also tethered her fate to the volatile destiny of Rome. The affair between Cleopatra and Caesar was not a mere romance, it was a collision of civilizations. She saw in him the guardian of Egypt's autonomy. He saw in her the key to securing Rome's grain supply and asserting control over the eastern Mediterranean. Their union was forged in necessity, inflamed by attraction, and elevated by a shared understanding of power. From Nile to Tiber, power plays and parenthood. In the shifting tides of history, few stories carry the delicate interweaving of politics and personal destiny, quite like Cleopatra's return to Egypt after Julius Caesar's assassination. Though her Roman protector had perished under a flurry of senatorial blades, Cleopatra was not simply a widow of influence. She was now a mother to Caesarion, the living embodiment of her ambition and the symbol of her most calculated alliance. But if she had hoped that motherhood would solidify her position, she quickly learned that the birth of a child in the shadow of empire was not the end of a struggle, but the beginning of a much more treacherous one. The years immediately following Caesar's death were anything but calm. Rome had been flung into chaos, its power vacuum exposing ambitions long hidden beneath the Senate's marble floors. Caesar's heir in the Roman will was not Caesarion, but Gaius Octavius, Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, a youth of delicate health and uncertain charm, who would later become Augustus. Cleopatra's young son had no claim in Roman law, no official recognition in Caesar's will, and no voice among the factions now tearing the Republic apart. But in Cleopatra's mind, the blood of Caesar ran truest in Caesarion. He was not just her son, he was a political asset, a claimant to a throne not yet his, a card to be played in a game as dangerous as it was complex. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra ruled with renewed intensity. She wore the crown not as a grieving widow, but as a goddess queen. Publicly, she embraced the role of Isis incarnate, mother to Horus, drawing a direct link between Caesarion and divine kingship. Temples and coins began to reflect this image. Caesarion, the child of divinity and power, was positioned as heir not only to Egypt but symbolically to the world. Cleopatra ruled alone, unbothered by traditional co-regency with a male counterpart, but her son was never far from her side. Carefully, groomed for greatness. This new chapter was not without enemies. Rome's Senate viewed her with suspicion, and Octavian, ambitious and calculating, saw Caesarion's existence as a direct threat to his legitimacy. If Cleopatra's son was indeed Caesar's natural heir, then Octavian's entire political rise could be called into question. The young Roman knew that Cleopatra's influence had to be checked and her son's claim neutralized. But Cleopatra, ever aware of the weight of perception, was no idle observer. She used every tool at her disposal to strengthen Egypt's autonomy, projecting wealth, culture, and continuity. Egypt during this time was stable, prosperous even. Trade flourished along the Nile, the granaries remained full, and Alexandria continued to attract thinkers, artisans, and merchants from across the Mediterranean. Cleopatra herself immersed Caesarion in a curriculum that rivaled any Roman senator's education. He learned Greek, Egyptian, Latin, and mathematics. He studied the philosophies of Plato and the sciences of Hipparchus. Cleopatra did not raise a prince, she raised a pharaoh and a potential emperor. Yet the throne of Rome was not empty, and into this vacuum entered Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, a man who had once been Caesar's ally and close friend. He was now part of the second triumvirate, alongside Octavian and Lepidus, and his control of the eastern provinces brought him directly into Cleopatra's orbit. When Antony summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus in 41 BCE to answer for her alleged support of Caesar's assassins, she did not come as a supplicant. She arrived downriver on a barge gilded with gold, its sails perfumed and dyed purple, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite. It was a theatrical display not unlike her first meeting with Caesar, but the stakes this time were far more personal. Cleopatra's future now depended on a new alliance, one that could protect her son and fend off Octavian's growing hostility. Antony, beguiled by her charisma and impressed by her political acumen, became enamored. Thus began a partnership that would rival her previous liaison in both power and passion. Antony returned with Cleopatra to Alexandria, and the two would eventually have 3 children together. But Cleopatra never allowed Caesarion to be eclipsed. Even as she raised new heirs, she ensured that the Roman world would not forget Caesar's true-born son. She continued to title him King of Kings, placing him above his half-siblings in court hierarchy. When Antony later declared Caesarion to be the legitimate heir of Julius Caesar during the infamous donations of Alexandria, it was a direct affront to Octavian, and perhaps Cleopatra's boldest move yet. That declaration was not merely maternal pride, it was a calculated blow in the war of legitimacy. Cleopatra was gambling with her son's future. Either Caesarion would rise above Octavian to claim his father's mantle, or he would become the target of Rome's most ruthless political animal. The lines between love, parenthood, and politics were never more blurred. What's remarkable is how Cleopatra balanced the public and private in her role as a mother. She did not retreat from power to raise her son in the shadows. Instead, she used motherhood as a sovereign tool. Portraits, coins, rituals, all reinforced the narrative of divine succession. Cleopatra as Isis, Caesarion as Horus, both eternal and sovereign. Yet behind the statues and proclamations was a mother who knew the danger looming on the horizon. Octavian's silence on Caesarion was ominous. Every Roman dispatch, every senator's whisper from across the sea was a reminder that the boy was born into a house of daggers. The later years of Cleopatra's life would see her fate, and that of her son, entirely entangled with Antony's. Their power grew, but so did Octavian's resentment. The world was headed toward a confrontation that would be shaped not only by military strategy and political propaganda, but by the question of Caesar's true heir. Was it the adopted son of convenience, or the blood-born son of Cleopatra? As the tides of empire prepared for one final clash, Cleopatra stood at the center, queen, lover, mother. Her son, her most sacred creation, was not just a boy. He was history's hinge, a figure who could unite 2 civilizations or be crushed beneath them. For now, he sat beside her on a throne gilded with Egyptian sun and Roman ambition. But the shadow of Rome loomed long across the Nile. Cleopatra had mastered the art of power, but even she could not fully shield her child from the games of men. Caesarion was no longer just the boy pharaoh of Egypt. He was becoming the battleground upon which the legacy of Julius Caesar would live, or perish, The Ides of March, betrayal and collapse. The streets of Rome bustled with life that fateful morning, unaware that history teetered on the edge of a blade. March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, was not yet marked by infamy. In the hearts of many Romans, it was simply a day for settling debts, a moment within the steady rhythm of their ancient calendar. But within the marbled halls of the Theatre of Pompey, where the Senate was to meet, the fate of the Republic would be rewritten in crimson. Julius Caesar, dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, entered those halls with an air of quiet confidence. His return from civil war had been triumphant, his reforms sweeping. He had redistributed land, regulated grain doles, bolstered public infrastructure, and even sought to integrate provincial elites into the Roman power structure. But for all his visionary changes, Caesar had amassed an unforgivable sum of power. To some, he was the savior of Rome. To others, a tyrant in regal disguise. Among the latter were men who had once been his allies. Senators who owed their rise to Caesar now whispered in marble corridors, unsettled by his growing ambition. The name king was never spoken openly, but the crown loomed heavy in rumour and speculation. Brutus, Cassius, Casca, and over 60 conspirators began to believe that the very soul of the Republic was under siege. For them, the dagger was not merely a weapon, it was a rescue plan. In the weeks leading up to the assassination, omens abounded. A soothsayer had famously warned Caesar to beware the Ides of March. His wife Calpurnia dreamt of his death and begged him to stay home. Animals sacrificed for augury revealed unnatural organs. Thunder cracked over Rome on cloudless days, and yet Caesar, with his characteristic dismissiveness towards superstition, brushed aside the warnings. Inside the Theatre of Pompey, senators gathered under the pretense of governance. Caesar entered, unarmed and surrounded by those he believed to be loyal. As he took his seat, the conspirators drew close, each man with a role in the carefully choreographed ritual of betrayal. What followed was brutal and swift. One dagger struck, then another and another, until Caesar, stunned and bleeding, looked into the eyes of his once trusted friend Marcus Junius Brutus. Et tu, Brute, he is said to have whispered. Whether apocryphal or true, those words have echoed through time, a chilling epitaph for friendship undone by ambition. When Caesar fell, Rome did not rejoice. The conspirators had imagined themselves as liberators, saviors of the Republic who would be hailed by the masses. But Rome did not rise in celebration. Instead, chaos unfolded. The public devoted to Caesar wept and rioted. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general and trusted confidant, seized control of the situation with sharp political instinct. In a stunning act of oratory at Caesar's funeral, Antony turned public opinion against the assassins, reading aloud Caesar's will, which included generous gifts to the Roman populace. The flame of outrage was lit. The liberators became fugitives. Far from the streets of Rome, Cleopatra received word of Caesar's death, not through a formal embassy, but likely through frantic coded messages from her informants. She was in Alexandria with Caesarion, the child whose entire future had been pinned to the strength of Caesar's rule. The news was devastating, not just emotionally, but strategically. Her protector was dead. Her son's claim to any Roman inheritance was in jeopardy. And worse, Rome had entered a violent and unpredictable era. The assassination of Caesar set off a domino effect of wars and power struggles. The fragile alliance of the second triumvirate, Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, was formed to crush the conspirators. Brutus and Cassius fled to the eastern provinces, gathering support and preparing for civil war. At Philippi in 42 BCE, they faced the armies of the triumvirs in a decisive confrontation. Both Brutus and Cassius would die. Brutus by suicide after defeat, Cassius in despair before the battles. These deaths marked the end of Republican dreams and the beginning of a new, more autocratic Rome. But with Caesar dead, the spotlight shifted. Who would inherit his mantle? The answer was complex. Octavian, as Caesar's adopted son and political heir, wielded legal legitimacy. Yet Cleopatra held the more dangerous card, Caesarion, Caesar's blood-born son. It was this living proof of Caesar's lineage that made Cleopatra not just a foreign queen, but a direct threat to Octavian's ambitions. In Alexandria, Cleopatra strengthened her position. She declared Caesarion co-ruler, giving him the title King of Kings. Together they issued decrees and minted coins. She reached out diplomatically to the triumvirs, carefully navigating the tension between appeasement and assertion. Her hope was to secure Egypt's sovereignty while protecting Caesarion's claim. But the presence of a royal heir to Caesar in a foreign court was a thorn in Octavian's side. This period also marked the deepening of Cleopatra's relationship with Mark Antony. With the triumvirs dividing the Roman territories among themselves, Antony took control of the eastern provinces. His political and military strength, combined with Cleopatra's wealth and naval power, formed a formidable axis. Their union was both romantic and tactical. But it also drew the ire of Octavian, who viewed their alliance and their children as a challenge to Rome's future. Meanwhile, the Roman people continued to mourn Caesar. His image became a symbol of both nostalgia and division. Statues were erected, games were held in his honor, and the comet that appeared shortly after his death was declared his soul ascending to the heavens. Caesar became deified, Divus Julius, and Octavian took on the title Divi Filius, the son of a god. Yet this divine narrative only underscored the danger posed by Caesarion, the actual son of Caesar. The Ides of March, meant to rescue the Republic, had instead birthed an empire. The conspirators' blades failed to stop the march of central authority. They had merely transferred its burden. The Republic had bled, and in its place rose a new order, one forged in war and crowned with ambition. Cleopatra, watching from afar, saw the shifting balance. She was no mere spectator. She was now a central player in a drama that reached beyond borders and bloodlines. Her son was the last living thread to a man whose death had shaken the world. And though Caesar had died, his legacy pulsed in the veins of Caesarion, waiting for its moment to reclaim what daggers had stolen. Mark Antony, soldier, statesman, lover. Mark Antony was not a man easily defined by a single title. He was a general, a politician, a fierce loyalist, and a lover whose passion burned with both brilliance and destruction. His life was a turbulent storm of valor and vanity, ambition and excess. As Rome transitioned from a republic to an empire, Antony stood at the heart of the transformation, a man molded by war, shaped by loyalty, and ultimately undone by love. Born in 83 BCE into the prominent but somewhat tarnished Antonia gens, Marcus Antonius grew up in a Rome riddled with internal strife. His father had held the office of praetor but died young, leaving Antony and his brothers to the care of their mother, Julia Antonia. His youth was marked by recklessness, drunken escapades, debts and brawls that worried the Roman elite. But beneath the chaos was a man of immense charisma and natural leadership, traits that would later define both his military prowess and his enduring influence. His military career began in earnest under Aulus Gabinius, with whom Antony fought in campaigns in Judea and Egypt. But it was under Julius Caesar that Antony's star truly rose. He became Caesar's trusted legate and right-hand man during the Gallic Wars, and later the civil war against Pompey. Antony's loyalty was unwavering. He stood with Caesar at every turn, even when it meant going against the Senate, against tradition, and against some of his own kin. In 44 BCE, when Caesar was assassinated, Antony was consul and among the most powerful men in Rome. He took control of Caesar's papers and treasury, giving him leverage and influence in the uncertain days that followed. His funeral oration for Caesar, delivered before a grieving and inflamed Roman crowd, was masterful in its manipulation of emotion and imagery. Antony turned public opinion against the conspirators and made himself the self-appointed guardian of Caesar's legacy. But Antony's dominance in Rome was soon challenged by Caesar's adopted heir Octavian. The young man, just 18 at the time, was underestimated by many, including Antony. But Octavian was calculating and ruthless, and he rapidly built a base of support among Caesar's veterans and the Senate. The rivalry grew fierce and bloody, culminating in the temporary alliance of the Second Triumvirate in 43 BCE, uniting Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. Together, they purged their enemies in Rome in a terrifying wave of proscriptions. The execution of Cicero, one of Rome's most respected orators and philosophers, was one of the most controversial acts carried out under their rule. As the empire was divided among the three, Antony took control of the eastern provinces. It was there, amid the faded grandeur of the Hellenistic world, that his destiny intertwined with Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt. Their meeting in 41 BCE at Tarsus was nothing short of theatrical. Cleopatra, understanding the power of spectacle, sailed up the Cydnus River on a barge adorned like the bark of Aphrodite, clothed as the goddess herself. Antony, enamoured by her wit, charm, and political cunning, fell quickly under her spell. What began as a diplomatic encounter blossomed into a legendary romance. Yet their union was not merely emotional, it was intensely strategic. Cleopatra needed a Roman protector to secure her reign and the future of her son Caesarion. Antony needed the wealth of Egypt to fund his campaigns and assert dominance in the east. Together they presented a formidable front. Antony moved to Alexandria, marrying Cleopatra in Egyptian custom, though he was already married in Rome, and declared Caesarion the legitimate son of Caesar, a direct challenge to Octavian. This act marked the beginning of the end for Antony's Roman career. In Rome, he was branded a traitor, a man bewitched by a foreign queen, squandering Roman wealth on Oriental luxuries. Octavian's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to portray Antony as corrupted and decadent, a man lost to Egyptian pleasures and Cleopatra's manipulations. The infamous Donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE, in which Antony distributed eastern territories to Cleopatra and her children, only deepened Roman suspicions. Still, Antony was no puppet. He was a seasoned commander who continued to wage war in Parthia and Armenia, albeit with mixed success. His failures in the east contrasted sharply with Octavian's increasing popularity in Rome. The Senate turned against Antony, stripping him of his titles and declaring war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra, a political maneuver to disguise civil war as a foreign conflict. Mark Antony, soldier, statesman, lover. Mark Antony was not a man easily defined by a single title. He was a general, a politician, a fierce loyalist, and a lover whose passion burned with both brilliance and destruction. His life was a turbulent storm of valour and vanity, ambition and excess. As Rome transitioned from a republic to an empire, Antony stood at the heart of the transformation, a man moulded by war, shaped by loyalty, and ultimately undone by love. Born in 83 BCE into the prominent but somewhat tarnished Antonia gens, Marcus Antonius grew up in a Rome riddled with internal strife. His father had held the office of praetor but died young, leaving Antony and his brothers to the care of their mother, Julia Antonia. His youth was marked by recklessness, drunken escapades, debts and brawls that worried the Roman elite. But beneath the chaos was a man of immense charisma and natural leadership, traits that would later define both his military prowess and his enduring influence. His military career began in earnest under Aulus Gabinius, with whom Antony fought in campaigns in Judea and Egypt. But it was under Julius Caesar that Antony's star truly rose. He became Caesar's trusted legate and right-hand man during the Gallic Wars, and later the civil war against Pompey. Antony's loyalty was unwavering. He stood with Caesar at every turn, even when it meant going against the Senate, against tradition, and against some of his own kin. In 44 BCE, when Caesar was assassinated, Antony was consul and among the most powerful men in Rome. He took control of Caesar's papers and treasury, giving him leverage and influence in the uncertain days that followed. His funeral oration for Caesar, delivered before a grieving and inflamed Roman crowd, was masterful in its manipulation of emotion and imagery. Antony turned public opinion against the conspirators and made himself the self-appointed guardian of Caesar's legacy. But Antony's dominance in Rome was soon challenged by Caesar's adopted heir Octavian. The young man, just 18 at the time, was underestimated by many, including Antony. But Octavian was calculating and ruthless, and he rapidly built a base of support among Caesar's veterans and the Senate. The rivalry grew fierce and bloody, culminating in the temporary alliance of the Second Triumvirate in 43 BCE, uniting Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. Together, they purged their enemies in Rome in a terrifying wave of proscriptions. The execution of Cicero, one of Rome's most respected orators and philosophers, was one of the most controversial acts carried out under their rule. As the empire was divided among the three, Antony took control of the eastern provinces. It was there, amid the faded grandeur of the Hellenistic world, that his destiny intertwined with Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt. Their meeting in 41 BCE at Tarsus was nothing short of theatrical. Cleopatra, understanding the power of spectacle, sailed up the Cydnus River on a barge adorned like the bark of Aphrodite, clothed as the goddess herself. Antony, enamored by her wit, charm, and political cunning, fell quickly under her spell. What began as a diplomatic encounter blossomed into a legendary romance. Yet their union was not merely emotional, it was intensely strategic. Cleopatra needed a Roman protector to secure her reign and the future of her son Caesarion. Antony needed the wealth of Egypt to fund his campaigns and assert dominance in the east. Together they presented a formidable front. Antony moved to Alexandria, marrying Cleopatra in Egyptian custom, though he was already married in Rome, and declared Caesarion the legitimate son of Caesar, a direct challenge to Octavian. This act marked the beginning of the end for Antony's Roman career. In Rome, he was branded a traitor, a man bewitched by a foreign queen, squandering Roman wealth on Oriental luxuries. Octavian's propaganda machine worked tirelessly to portray Antony as corrupted and decadent, a man lost to Egyptian pleasures and Cleopatra's manipulations. The infamous Donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE, in which Antony distributed eastern territories to Cleopatra and her children, only deepened Roman suspicions. Still, Antony was no puppet. He was a seasoned commander who continued to wage war in Parthia and Armenia, albeit with mixed success. His failures in the east contrasted sharply with Octavian's increasing popularity in Rome. The Senate turned against Antony, stripping him of his titles and declaring war, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra, a political maneuver to disguise civil war as a foreign conflict, or as a foreign bloodlines and shadows. Did Cleopatra's line survive? When Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, took her final breath in the shadow of a crumbling empire, the world believed a chapter had closed forever. Her fall marked not only the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, but also the last sovereign breath of ancient Egypt. Yet, as the dust settled over the sands of Alexandria and the Roman eagle replaced the pharaoh's crown, one question lingered in hushed corners of palaces, temples, and markets alike. Did Cleopatra's bloodline truly end with her? The simple answer is no, and yes. Officially, the direct political line of Cleopatra and the Ptolemies died with her and her son Caesarion. But bloodlines are rarely so neat, especially in the ancient world, where power bred secrets, and children of rulers often vanished into the folds of history or re-emerged in lands far from their birthplace. Cleopatra had more than one child, and some, it seems, did not vanish entirely. To unravel this mystery, we must first look at her children, not just Caesarion, but the lesser-known trio she bore with Mark Antony, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene II, and Ptolemy Philadelphus. After their parents' suicides in 30 BCE, these 3 young children, symbols of a once grand Hellenistic dream, were taken to Rome. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, paraded them through the streets in his triumph, a public celebration that marked his conquest of Egypt. It was a ruthless political theatre, the golden chains, the stunned silence of the orphans, the image of Egyptian royalty now helpless before Roman glory. But Octavian, pragmatic and image-conscious, did not execute these children as he had Caesarion. Their fate was more complex. The twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene were only about 10 years old, and their younger brother Ptolemy Philadelphus even younger. They were placed in the care of Octavia Minor, Mark Antony's former wife and Octavian's sister, who raised them in her household as Roman aristocrats, not Egyptian royalty. From that moment, their paths diverged. Alexander Helios, whose name evoked the sun god, disappears from the historical record. Some believe he died in adolescence, perhaps from illness or political foul play. Others speculate he may have been quietly removed or absorbed into Roman nobility under a different name, living a life stripped of the grandeur his name suggested. No tomb, inscription, or confirmed account survives. Ptolemy Philadelphus, the youngest, shares a similar fate of obscurity. No adult record of him exists, leading scholars to conclude he died young, possibly before reaching manhood. Given the political threat any child of Cleopatra posed to Augustus' new regime, it's plausible he was either executed quietly or allowed to fade in isolation. Cleopatra Selene too, however, is a different story. Unlike her brothers, Selene grew up to play a unique role in bridging worlds. In a diplomatic masterstroke, Augustus arranged her marriage to Juba II, a Roman-educated North African prince who ruled Mauritania, modern-day Morocco and Algeria, under Rome's patronage. The match was more than convenience. It was strategy. It offered Selene a throne, albeit a Romanized one, and tied her legacy safely into the fabric of the empire. In Mauritania, Cleopatra Selene became a queen in her own right. Together with Juba II, she turned their kingdom into a beacon of Hellenistic and Roman fusion. Their capital, Caesarea, modern Churchill, Algeria, was modelled after Alexandria, complete with Greek architecture, art, libraries, and even a lighthouse resembling the Pharos. Coins minted in her name bore Egyptian symbols and the title Queen Cleopatra, suggesting that she never fully renounced her heritage. Under her rule, Mauritania flourished. Trade expanded, arts were patronized, and local cultures merged with imported Alexandrian traditions. Selene gave birth to at least one son, Ptolemy of Mauritania, named after her father's dynasty. He would later rule Mauritania and be recognized by Rome, even appearing in the court of Caligula. Yet his story ends in violence. He was executed by Caligula, likely out of jealousy or suspicion of his lineage and popularity. With his death in 40 CE, the royal line of Cleopatra as a recognized political force met its end. But was this truly the last chapter? Not necessarily. Genealogical threads are often longer than they appear. While royal claims died, the bloodlines likely did not. Cleopatra Selene's offspring may have had descendants who blended into the Roman aristocracy or married into African, Iberian, or Middle Eastern lineages. Records from this era are incomplete, and imperial politics often erased inconvenient legacies. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, several noble families claimed descent from Cleopatra, often through romanticized or speculative genealogies. Whether these claims were true or simply expressions of admiration is difficult to prove. The Medicis, for example, fashioned themselves heirs to the classical world, not just in art, but in blood. Legends arose of Eastern queens, desert princesses, and North African dynasties, carrying the last flame of Cleopatra's heritage through turbulent centuries. One particularly fascinating theory suggests that Cleopatra's bloodline filtered into Arab or Berber nobility through Selene's Mauritanian descendants. North African oral traditions speak of ancient queens of wisdom and beauty, some of whom resemble the descriptions of Selene. Yet without archaeological or genetic confirmation, these remain tantalizing shadows, stories half hidden by time. What cannot be denied, however, is the cultural survival of Cleopatra's legacy. Through Selene, Many of Cleopatra's political ideals, fusion of East and West, promotion of knowledge, symbolic rulership, continued long after Egypt fell. Her descendants may not have sat on thrones, but they lived in legends, philosophies, and the architectural echoes of lost cities. And then there is the matter of perception. To the Romans, Cleopatra was a seductive threat, a woman who dared to challenge the order of empire. To Egyptians, she was a divine monarch who stood as the last guardian of their independence. But to many historians, she became the embodiment of a lineage whose reach extended beyond borders, beyond even death. Today, genetic studies and archaeological inquiries continue to explore the lineages of ancient royalty. The tomb of Cleopatra and Antony remains elusive, its discovery perhaps holding the answers to some of these enduring mysteries. If bones were found and confirmed, if DNA could be matched to ancient remains in Mauritania or Roman tombs, we might yet uncover the echoes of her bloodline. But even in absence, Cleopatra's line survives, if not in genes, then in memory. The woman who dared to love emperors, challenge empires, and rule as pharaoh left behind more than children. She left a story so profound, so richly woven into the fabric of civilization, that her blood flows still, not through veins, but through poetry, politics, and the eternal fascination she commands. Legacy of love and empire. In the grand theatre of history, few romances have resonated as powerfully as that of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, and later, Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Their stories, etched into marble, papyrus, and myth, continue to echo across centuries, not merely for the sensual allure of their love, but for the monumental consequences that love wrought upon the ancient world. The legacy they left behind is a complex tapestry of ambition, passion, betrayal, and transformation, where personal desires ignited wars and shaped empires, and where love became a force that redefined the fate of nations. Long after the sands of Alexandria had swallowed the bones of its once ruling queen, and the Roman banners had replaced Egyptian iconography, the narrative of Cleopatra's life refused to fade into obscurity. Instead, it transformed, morphing with each retelling by poets, philosophers, emperors, and dramatists, until it became less a biography and more a legend. But legends carry legacies, and legacies shape futures. Cleopatra's legacy begins not just with her romance, but with her rule. She was not merely a consort or queen in the shadow of Rome's titans. She was a sovereign in her own right. Fluent in multiple languages, educated in philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, and political science, Cleopatra VII was a formidable leader of Egypt. Her decision to align herself with Caesar and after his death with Antony was not merely a matter of the heart. These were calculated political maneuvers as much as they were acts of love. She saw in Caesar and Antony not only lovers but partners with whom she could preserve Egypt's sovereignty in a world fast being devoured by Rome. The birth of Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, marked her most audacious political gamble, an heir who could one day unite the legacies of Rome and Egypt. His existence alone threatened Octavian's plans to become Rome's sole ruler, and the boy's fate remains one of the murkier shadows of this legacy. Official Roman records claim Caesarion was eliminated shortly after Cleopatra's death, allegedly on Octavian's orders, yet whispers persisted for years, of a boy spirited away, of bloodlines preserved in secrecy, of a rightful heir hidden in the East. The myth of Caesarion fueled countless legends and gave rise to alternate histories, especially in parts of the Middle East and Africa, where tales of an Eastern prince of divine birth lingered. The romantic legacy, though, was just as enduring. Cleopatra and Antony's love was no fleeting dalliance. It was incendiary, consuming, and ultimately fatal. Their bond challenged the patriarchal norms of their time. Antony was seen to be under the spell of the Egyptian queen, abandoning his Roman wife Fulvia and later Octavia, sister of Octavian, for the Queen of the Nile. This became political fodder for Octavian's propaganda, branding Antony a traitor and a fool manipulated by foreign lust. The Senate's declaration of war against Cleopatra rather than Antony was a deliberate rhetorical maneuver, casting the conflict not as civil war but as Rome defending itself against Eastern corruption. Despite the slander, what emerged over time was a more nuanced understanding of their union. In Egypt, Cleopatra and Antony were seen as deities, Isis and Osiris reborn. They ruled jointly, issued decrees together, minted coins bearing both their likenesses, and named their children as successors to various eastern territories. Their romance was a strategic alliance as much as a passionate affair, and while it ultimately failed to stem Rome's advance, it stood as the last great resistance to imperial domination from the east. Their suicides, dramatic and symbolic, sealed their transformation from political figures to romantic martyrs. Cleopatra's legendary death by asp bite, though disputed by modern historians, was forever immortalized in art and literature. Shakespeare's rendition in Antony and Cleopatra crystallized their love in Western cultural memory as one of the greatest tragic romances of all time. But beyond the tragedy, there remained a profound question. What would the world have looked like if they had won? Had Antony triumphed at Actium? Had Egypt retained its independence? Had Caesarion ascended as Caesar's legitimate heir? The entire trajectory of European and Middle Eastern history might have shifted. The dominance of the Roman Empire, and by extension Western civilization, would have faced a powerful counterweight. A Greco-Egyptian-Roman hybrid empire could have altered the course of religious spread, linguistic development, trade routes, and even the colonial mindset centuries later. Instead, their defeat cemented Rome's supremacy and ushered in the Augustan Age, where imperial consolidation replaced the pluralistic dream Cleopatra envisioned. Still, Cleopatra's influence endured. In centuries following her death, rulers and leaders across cultures cited her as a symbol, either of seductive power or sovereign autonomy. Elizabeth I of England, Catherine the Great of Russia, and even 20th century feminist movements re-examined Cleopatra as a complex figure, not just a temptress, but a capable, cunning and cultured woman who dared to lead and love on her own terms. Rome too could not escape the legacy of Cleopatra and Antony. Octavian, despite emerging victorious, knew the threat they posed in memory and myth. His regime worked tirelessly to erase or reshape their narrative. Temples were destroyed, records burned, statues melted. But memory is tenacious. Artists, historians, and common folk kept their story alive, sometimes in secret, sometimes in satire, sometimes in sorrow. The fact that Cleopatra remained more iconic than many of the emperors who followed speaks volumes about the potency of her image. Even religious narratives weren't immune. Early Christian writers debated Cleopatra's morality, some vilifying her as a pagan corrupter, others admiring her loyalty and sacrifice. In Coptic Christian communities of Egypt, she sometimes appeared in folk stories as a misunderstood heroine, with her death seen not as suicide but martyrdom against foreign invasion. As time marched on, their legacy slipped into new forms. In the Renaissance, Cleopatra's image re-emerged in sculpture, opera and portraiture. In the 19th and 20th centuries, with the rise of Egyptomania, her likeness adorned everything from perfume bottles to political cartoons. Hollywood transformed her once more, sometimes a vamp, sometimes a queen, but always unforgettable. But legacies are not only made of monuments or movies, they are made in the echoes of decisions, the ripples of relationships, and the inheritance of choices made long ago. Cleopatra and Antony's choice to resist Rome, to love in defiance of empire, was a moment of human passion set against a backdrop of global transformation. Their personal saga reflected the struggle between East and West, between empire and identity, between love and duty. Their descendants, while officially erased by Rome, may yet have seeded distant lines. Some genealogists and speculative historians suggest that Cleopatra's blood might have filtered into European or Levantine nobility. Though unproven, the very possibility adds another thread to their legend, a reminder that bloodlines fade, but stories endure. Today, when visitors stand amid the ruins of Alexandria or gaze upon Caesar's bust in Rome's Forum, Component placement. They do so not just to witness stone and history, but to feel the tremors of lives that burned so brightly they still warm our imagination. The love between Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, and later Mark Antony, was not just scandalous or strategic, it was seismic. It redrew the map of the known world, toppled dynasties, and gave birth to an empire whose echo still shapes our modern political and cultural world. In the final reckoning, their story is less about loss and more about resonance. The world they loved in, fought for, and ultimately died within no longer exists. But their dream of a world united by passion and power, a world where love could defy even the might of Rome, remains a monument built not of stone but of story.